No one remembered her name. No one asked where she came from. She never said a word, and yet, she changed everything. One man traded a sack of corn for a silent stranger. But what he got was a guardian he never expected. When bullets finally came for him, her silence spoke louder than any war cry. This is not a love story. This is a reckoning. Thought it begins now. Chapter 1. The Trade. The town square smelled of dust, horse sweat, and something cooked too long in the sun. It was market day, the kind that brought wagons from dry hills and pockets from empty hands. Crates of onions, rusted tools, a few tired chickens, and her. She stood barefoot in the shade of the old courthouse wall, silent, still. Her eyes were low, not in shame, but in exhaustion, as though looking up had become a luxury she'd traded long ago. She didn't fidget, she didn't beg, just stood with her hands at her sides and a rope loosely tied around her wrists. Not tight, just enough to say she was not her own. The man behind her spoke too loudly, trying to sound official. 1 sack of corn, that's all we're asking. She. Don't talk, don't eat much, and don't start trouble. Better than a mule if you ask me. No one laughed. No one moved. Until the rancher did. He stepped forward, boots worn, hat dust-covered, shoulders hunched not from fear but from the weight of years that hadn't been kind. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask where she came from or what had silenced her. He simply untied the rope, nodded once, and handed over a coarse, half-full sack of dried corn. The man behind her smirked. Pleasure doing business. The rancher didn't answer. She followed him without protest. No words passed between them as they walked the narrow street, past glances from porch shadows and windows left half open. Some shook their heads, others whispered, a few turned away altogether. It wasn't the first time the town had seen something like this, but it might be the last time anyone stayed quiet about it. At the edge of town, he mounted his horse and offered her his hand. She paused, just long, enough for him to think she might refuse, then took it. Her fingers were cold, calloused, light as twine. The ride back to the ranch was slow and silent. The prairie stretched out like an old map, creased, faded, and waiting for something to happen. Wind moved through the grass but didn't speak. The sun lowered behind a ridge. Coyotes sang in the distance. She didn't ask where they were going. He didn't say. Got by nightfall, they arrived. A modest cabin, a split fence, a rusted lantern swinging on the porch. He opened the door, stepped aside, and waited. She didn't hesitate. Inside, the floor creaked under her steps. The air smelled like wood smoke and old earth. She found the farthest corner of the room, knelt, and sat with her back to the wall, watching. He set a plate of bread and beans on the table, but didn't press it toward her. He just left it there. Then he sat by the fire, pulled off his boots, and said nothing at all. She didn't eat, not that night, but her eyes stayed open long after he fell asleep. And though the fire crackled and the coyotes cried, she never made a sound. Chapter 2. The House Without Words. She hadn't spoken a single word since she arrived. Not on the trail. Not when he offered her water. Not when the wind screamed through the open plains like a warning from the gods. Days passed in quiet procession, each one folding into the next with only the creak of wood, the groan of old hinges, and the subtle rustle of her movement across the floor. The rancher was not a man of many words himself, but her silence was different. It wasn't absence, it was presence. He began to notice how it filled the house, how her footsteps had their own rhythm, soft, sure, neither hurried nor hesitant. How she folded the blanket each morning with a precision that felt almost ritualistic. How she stepped around loose floorboards and paused at every threshold, like she was memorizing the bones of the place. She didn't flinch when he moved, but she didn't come close either. She lived in the house like a shadow might, quiet, observant, woven into the edges of things, yet she missed nothing. When he placed a plate on the table, she waited until he stepped back before reaching for it. She ate in silence, eyes always downward, chewing slowly, never too much, never too little, like someone who had once been punished for wanting more. At night, she slept on the floor. Though he offered the cot, she shook her head once, the only gesture he'd seen her make, and returned to the woven mat in the corner. She curled there like she belonged to the space, like it knew her story already. He didn't ask her why. He just made sure the fire burned steady through the cold hours, so she wouldn't wake up shivering. One night, a storm rolled in, sudden and loud, with thunder that cracked the sky like it meant to split the land in two. The roof groaned, wind clawed at the shutters, and the barn door slammed open somewhere in the distance. Still, she didn't cry out. She sat upright, legs tucked under her, staring at the fire. Her eyes didn't blink with the flashes of lightning. Her body didn't tremble with the rolling booms above. Her silence was not fear. It was armor. It was history. The rancher watched her from his chair across the room, unsure if he was looking at someone who had survived something, or someone who was still in the middle of it. The storm passed by morning, leaving behind only soaked earth and broken branches. She was already outside when he woke, hauling wood to the pile behind the cabin. Sleeves rolled, hair tied. The sky was still gray, but she moved through it like color, quiet, deliberate, present. He didn't speak as he joined her. She didn't look up, but they worked side by side for an hour, and the silence between them felt like something earned, not avoided. It was the kind of quiet that makes noise feel unnecessary, the kind that builds trust without a single word. And though she still hadn't said a thing, the house was no longer empty. Chapter 3: A town that never forgets. The town had a long memory, not in names, not in dates. Those were always the first to fade, but in stories, half-true ones, told in the spaces between chores and passed like smoke between porches and poker tables. And now, there was a new story to tell. They whispered it behind curtains and from the corners of saloons, about the silent woman, about the sack of corn, and about the man who brought her home. Most of them hadn't seen the trade themselves, but that didn't matter. Someone always knew someone who had, and that was enough to feed the flames. She don't speak, they say, wasn't even tied up proper. Maybe she followed him willingly. Maybe she wanted to disappear. The words were never loud, but they drifted through the general store, across the pews on Sunday, around the water trough out back of the saloon. Each version of the story twisted slightly, like a knife being tested for sharpness. But no one said it to his face, because they remembered who he used to be. The man who rode with a sheriff's badge pinned to his chest and fire in his eyes, the one who brought in outlaws with a split lip and never missed a shot in the dark. He had changed since those days, worn thinner, quieter, but no one could say for sure that the fire was gone. And the girl, she didn't give them anything to work with. When she came into town with him, she walked a half step behind, eyes low, hands folded in front of her. She didn't flinch at stares, didn't respond to murmurs. She moved like a ghost, but she wasn't drifting. She was studying. She watched everything, how they shifted when she passed, how the barkeep suddenly found something to wipe, how the preacher's wife clutched her purse just a little tighter. She noticed it all and said nothing. The blacksmith's apprentice spat near her boots once. She didn't react, but the rancher's stare afterward turned the boy pale. In the weeks that followed, they returned only when necessary for nails, feed, salt. Always brief, always wordless, but the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they deepened. Some said she was a runaway. Others swore she was cursed. One woman swore she recognized her from a poster years old, half-burned. And through it all, the town did what towns do best. It speculated, it judged, and it remembered. But behind the rumors, behind the cautious glances, there was something else growing, something the townspeople weren't ready to admit. Curiosity. And maybe a little fear, because the woman who didn't speak, who had come from nowhere and followed no rules, had found a place not just in the ranch, but beside the man who had once carried justice like a second skin. And if she stayed, there might be more to the story than they'd ever understand. Chapter 4: What the fire didn't take. The land didn't question her silence. It welcomed her in its own way, through calloused palms on dry soil, through the rhythm of water pulled from the well, through weeds tugged from their stubborn roots. Under a heavy sun, she worked the ranch like someone repairing a wounded body. She didn't ask what needed doing, she already knew. The way she moved told the truth. Her hands had healed before. She woke before the light, swept the porch, collected eggs, mended torn cloth with tiny, perfect stitches. Her presence didn't disturb the order of the place, it deepened it. The ranch, once marked by quiet loneliness, now pulsed with a different kind of quiet. Steady one, a living one. The rancher watched from a distance. She didn't speak to him, but she left things where he'd find them. An extra bucket filled near the fence, a jar of dried herbs beside the firewood, a trail cleared through the overgrown thistle. She didn't demand notice. She just offered care, the way the land does, silently, constantly. But it was at night, when the chores were done and the wind had died down, that she returned to the part of herself the fire never touched. She would sit by the window, lamp glowing behind her like a soft halo, and pull back her sleeve, slowly, deliberately, as if asking permission from her own skin. The scar was long, jagged like lightning, frozen into flesh. Not fresh, but still angry, still raw under the lantern light. She would press her fingers to it, not to soothe, but to remember. Her face never changed, but her breath did. Slower, thinner, like the wound pulled something from her each time she touched it. He saw her once, from the hall. She didn't look up, she didn't hide it, and so, he didn't ask. Some things don't need names, some stories stay in the skin, not on the tongue, but in that moment, under the quiet hum of crickets, and the fading hiss of firewood, something passed between them. Not pity, not comfort. Recognition. The kind that only exists between survivors. By morning, the scar would be covered again, and she'd return to work, tying tomatoes to posts, gathering seed, raking the barn floor, in lines straight as scripture. No one else saw the mark. No one else would know how she earned it, but the land did, and the land, like her, bore its wounds in silence. Chapter 5. The Stranger with the Gold Ring. He arrived the way rot does, slowly, quietly, and with something sweet on the surface. No one knew his name, but he didn't seem bothered by that. He made quick friends at the saloon, paid in full, without blinking, and smiled with the kind of ease that made honest men squint. His boots were polished, his voice smooth, and his laugh just a little too practiced. But it was the ring that gave him away. Thick, golden, heavy, a band that belonged to someone who believed in owning things. On his left hand, third finger, the kind of finger that once curled around a whip, the kind that knew how to hold power and take it away. He said he came for business, maybe land, maybe horses, maybe nothing. People believed him because it was easier than not, until he saw her. She had come into town with the rancher that day, a quiet visit for salt, tobacco, and nails. She stood beside the wagon, eyes on the ground, arms folded like always, a ghost in broad daylight. And the stranger's smile died the moment he looked at her. He froze just for a second, but long enough. His eyes narrowed, not in confusion. In memory, he knew her. She knew it too. She didn't flinch, but her hands curled slightly at her sides. Her chin stayed low, but her shoulders tightened. Not in fear, in readiness. The rancher noticed. The stranger approached. "Fine day," he said, too loud, too bright. His voice carried over the quiet street like oil over water. The rancher didn't answer, just stared at the man's ring. The stranger tipped his hat to the woman, but she didn't move, didn't look up, didn't breathe. And in that moment, the air changed. The saloon doors no longer creaked with laughter. The horses outside the blacksmith's stopped pawing at the dust. Even the wind, so used to roaming freely, seemed to hold its breath. The man didn't push. He turned, chuckled to himself, and walked away slowly, as if he'd forgotten what he came for. But he didn't forget her, and she hadn't forgotten him. Later that evening, back at the ranch, she stood outside until the sky turned purple and the crickets fell quiet. She didn't say a word, but she didn't need to, because the past had found her face again, and this time, it wore a gold ring. Chapter 6. The Gun in the Grain. The barn had a particular kind of quiet, the kind that carried weight. Dust hung in the beams like it had settled there decades ago and decided to stay. Every sound in that place echoed, the creak of old wood, the slow drag of a boot, the soft rustle of barley sacks stacked 5 high in the far corner. She wasn't looking for anything that day, just barley for the hens. Just one more quiet task in a life made entirely of quiet things. But when she pulled the top sack away, something shifted underneath, something heavier than grain, something wrapped in oilcloth and history. Her fingers froze, the air thinned. Slowly, she set the sack aside and reached in. The cloth was stained and stiff with time, its edges frayed like the memory of a name long unspoken. She peeled it back, a revolver. Old, but not rusted. The kind of weapon a man might have once slept beside, the kind you didn't lose by accident. She didn't ask whose it was, she didn't bring it inside, she just sat down right there in the barn's half-light, cross-legged in the hay, and turned it over in her hands. The weight of it didn't surprise her. She knew how a gun should feel, That was clear the moment she opened the chamber with steady fingers and inspected each cylinder like a ritual. 5 bullets, 1 empty chamber, worn grip, still reliable. She gathered a rag from the saddle bench, dipped it into a bucket of cold water, and began to clean. Methodical, careful, no rush. The way someone sharpens a knife they might never use, but can't afford to leave dull. By the time the sun began to slide low across the barn's slatted walls, the gun gleamed softly in her lap. She didn't smile, she didn't frown, she just nodded to herself a slight, imperceptible motion, and loaded all 6 chambers. Then she tucked the revolver beneath her coat, rose to her feet, and went back to her chores. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat on the porch with the gun in her lap, the lamp behind her casting a long shadow across the floorboards. Her gaze never strayed from the edge of the dark, from the fields, from the road, from the horizon where shapes could shift and men could come walking. The rancher noticed. He stepped outside, boots quiet, voice quieter. "You find it," she didn't answer. But he saw the gun in her lap, the way her hand rested on it like it had always been there, and the way her eyes looked past him, not at him, like she was watching for something he couldn't see. He didn't ask where she'd found it. He didn't ask if she knew how to use it. He just sat beside her, both of them staring out into the black. For a long time, neither spoke. Then, softly, almost too soft to hear, "You planning to use it?" Still, she said nothing, but her hand tightened slightly around the grip, and that was answer enough, because she wasn't afraid, she wasn't waiting for permission. She was preparing. For what? He didn't know yet, but the way she sat, spine straight, jaw still, heart steady, told him something had shifted, that the past hadn't just found her again. It had followed her home. And this time, she wasn't going to hide. This time, she was ready to meet it. Chapter 7. The day. The dust rose. The dust rose before the sound reached them. It began as a faint shimmer on the horizon, a ripple in the late evening heat, like the land itself was holding its breath. Then came the low hum of hooves, muffled and steady, not hurried, not wild, a purposeful rhythm. For horses, for men, one of them with a gold ring that caught the dying sun like a flare. She was chopping kindling when she saw them. She stopped mid-swing, didn't blink, didn't move, just stared at the rising cloud beyond the ridge, at the silhouettes pushing through it, slow as judgment. Inside the cabin, the rancher poured a second cup of coffee without looking up. "They're here, aren't they?" She nodded once. He set the cup down, walked to the rifle resting near the door, and checked the chamber with the casual precision of someone who hadn't forgotten how. His face didn't change, but his shoulders tensed just slightly, like a man remembering the weight of war after years of peace. Outside, the dust rolled forward, soft and golden, until it reached the edge of the yard. Then the men stopped. The stranger with the gold ring sat straight in his saddle. His smile from days ago was gone, replaced by something colder, measured. He looked at the ranch house like it was a thing he already owned. One of his men lit a cigar, another spat into the dirt, the third loosened his coat to make room for the pista underneath. They didn't come to talk. The rancher stepped onto the porch, rifle at his side, eyes fixed forward. "This land's not for sale," he called out. The stranger didn't respond. He just tilted his head slightly and looked past the man, right at her. She stepped out from behind the cabin, slow, steady, revolver at her hip, coat open, hair tied back. She didn't look at the rancher, didn't look at the ring. She looked at all 4 men, and not a single part of her flinched. "I see you remember me," the stranger said. His voice was smooth, but the edge beneath it could cut stone. She didn't answer. "I always knew you'd end up hiding behind someone else's walls." Still, nothing. The rancher shifted, ready to speak, but she raised her hand gently. He stopped. Then she stepped forward, 3 steps, then 4, until she stood at the edge of the porch, just one boot resting on the dirt. She was within range, now, so were they. The air turned heavy. Crickets fell silent. The dust settled between them like ash. "You took something," the stranger said, "years ago, from me, from my men." She slowly reached into her coat. The 3 others tensed, hands twitching near their holsters. But she didn't draw the gun. She pulled out a cloth, unfolded it, held it out. Inside, a silver pendant, tarnished, familiar. The rancher glanced at it, confused. The stranger's smile twitched, not in joy, but in rage. "You kept it," he hissed. She didn't nod, didn't explain. because this wasn't about the pendant. It was about what came after. About scars that ran longer than memory. About fire. About silence. And about the moment where a woman who'd once been sold for a sack of corn now stood between death and the only place she'd ever chosen. Then she spoke. 2 words. Not again. Chapter 8. What silence sounds like in battle. It happened fast. Violence always does. 1 heartbeat, they were standing still, for men, and 2 words lingering in the heavy air like sparks refusing to catch. The next, the stranger's fingers twitched, too quick, too certain. She saw it before the others did. The flash of a hand toward a holster. The shift in posture, not a threat, but a promise. And so, she fired first. The sound tore through the dusk like a thunderclap, sharp, final. The first bullet caught the man to the left of the stranger in the shoulder, spinning him sideways into the dust. The others moved too late. By the time the stranger's revolver cleared leather, she had already fired again. 2 down. The third ducked behind a wagon, firing wildly. Bullets screamed past the porch, slicing through wood, air, silence. 1 cracked through a shutter. Another punched into the beam beside the rancher's head. Still, she didn't flinch. She moved like she'd been here before. Knees bent, breath calm, steps measured. Not wild, not scared, just steady. The rancher returned fire from the porch, taking cover behind a barrel. His aim was precise, but he knew, even as he fired, that something had changed. That this wasn't his fight anymore. Not entirely. Not like it used to be. This time, she was leading it. The stranger crouched behind his horse, eyes burning. He shouted something, a name, maybe, or a curse. She didn't answer. She was already circling wide, cutting through the side path behind the shed, moving faster than his voice could track. Another shot rang out. Then, another dot. By the time he turned, she was there, flanking him from the right. Pistol raised, dust in her eyes, sweat down her neck. She fired. The horse screamed and bucked, bolting into the field. The stranger fell hard, gun tumbling from his hand. She approached slowly, not rushing, not wasting breath. He looked up, blood at his temple, hand reaching for nothing. "You think this makes you clean?" he spat. She stared down at him, no anger, no fear. Just the cold clarity of someone who had long ago run out of room for regret. Then, she pulled the hammer back. A pause, a silence so deep it swallowed every sound, the crackling barn, the shouts, the wind, even the far-off coyotes that always watched from the hills. And in that silence, she holstered her gun, turned and walked away. He lay there, stunned, defeated, alive, because mercy was a kind of revenge. 2, at the porch, the rancher stood slowly, wiping blood from a cut on his arm. "You didn't have to spare him," he said. She looked at him, eyes unreadable. But in her stillness, in her silence, there was a weight heavier than 1,000 spoken words. He understood, because some victories weren't loud. Some weren't marked by who was left lying on the ground, but by who was strong enough to walk away. That night, as they cleaned the wounds and swept the blood from the boards, he watched her by the fire. She sat where she always did, still, quiet, hands folded. But something in her had shifted, hardened, not broken, settled, and for the first time, he didn't see the girl who'd been bought for a sack of corn. He saw the woman who had just saved his life. Chapter 9. The price of her name. The gunfire had long stopped. The last echoes of violence clung to the barn. Walls like smoke that refused to clear. Blood darkened the earth in patches where the bodies had fallen, then been carried away. A wheelbarrow creaked in the distance. A dog barked once, and then silence. Not the kind she used to carry. This one was different. Earned. Shared. The sheriff arrived just after sundown, as he always did, late enough to avoid the danger, early enough to ask the questions. He came on horseback, flanked by 2 deputies, with tired eyes and clean boots. The rancher met him at the gate. "They came uninvited," he said, voice low. "Shot first." She ended it. The sheriff nodded, slow. He wasn't here to argue, just to see. He walked the perimeter, looked at the holes in the porch wood, at the blood on the threshold, at the men, 2 dead, 1 wounded, 1 who had disappeared into the hills. He said nothing for a long time. Then, he turned to her. She was standing in the doorway, revolver still holstered, arms crossed, dirt on her face and a line of dried blood across one cheek that she hadn't bothered to wipe away. Her eyes didn't waver when he looked at her name. He asked, a single word, simple, expected. but it hung in the air like a weight waiting to drop. The rancher glanced at her, not in pressure, not in fear, just waiting, like the rest of the land. She stared at the sheriff, then at the townfolk behind him. Faces had gathered again near the edge of the fence, behind wagons, by the watering trough, curious, cautious, watching the woman who had become the story no one could finish. She could lie, she could shrug, she could remain the mystery they'd all invented. But instead, she spoke. Not loudly, not with pride, just clearly. "My name is Alina." The wind shifted. A chicken clucked in the distance. No one moved. The sheriff blinked. "Alina," she didn't answer. That was all they would get, and it was enough, because that name, simple as it was, hit the town like thunder over dry land. Not because of what it meant, but because of what it cost. Because it hadn't been given to her. Because she hadn't whispered it in the dark. Because she had chosen to say it aloud. Here, now, in the aftermath. That name wasn't a confession. It was a claim. A line drawn in the dust, carved by fire, defended by bullets. And when the crowd dispersed, slowly, unsure of what to carry back with them, they didn't speak in hushed tones. They didn't speculate. They just said her name, like it belonged here. That night, the sheriff filed no charges. He rode off without asking for more. Because deep down, even he understood there was justice written into the soil that no badge could overwrite. Back inside, she washed the blood from her face, sat by the fire, stared into the flames. The rancher poured her tea without a word. She didn't speak again that night. She didn't need to, because the silence no longer asked questions. It answered them. Chapter 10. The Woman Who Stayed. Spring came quietly. No parade of flowers, no sudden warmth, just a slow softening of the ground, frozen edges turning to mud, wind shifting from sharp to kind. The fields, once pale with dust and dried blood, began to breathe again. And so did she. They offered her everything after the shooting. Papers, a train ticket, a place in the next county where no one knew her name, where the story hadn't spread like roots into the soil. Even the sheriff returned with a sealed envelope stamped, signed, legal, freedom, he called it, a way out. She stared at the papers for a long time that morning, sat with them on the porch while the wind played with the corner of the envelope like a child testing a boundary. She read the words, the promise of protection, a plot of land up north, a chance to vanish again, but she didn't sign. She stood up, fed the chickens, and never opened the envelope again. Because she had already chosen. She stayed. Not out of fear, not from debt, not even for the rancher. Though their silence had grown warm over time, and their shared glances had deepened into something that didn't need naming. She stayed because the land stayed with her. This place cracked, burned, still healing, was the first thing that didn't try to change her. It had accepted her silence, her scars, her stillness. It had watched her bleed, watched her fight, and now, it let her grow. She walked the perimeter each morning with the rifle slung across her back. She learned which birds came early and which wind meant rain. She fixed fences, dug soil, mended tools. Her hands, once marked only by violence, now bore calluses from building things that lasted. The townspeople no longer stared when she came in for feed or nails. They nodded. Sometimes they offered a cup of coffee. Once, the preacher's wife handed her a bundle of dried lavender and said, simply, for the window. No one asked where she came from anymore. They knew where she stood. She wasn't the girl with no voice. She was the woman who stayed. And the rancher, he never asked her why, but he built her a second chair for the porch. She used it every evening. Together, they sat in the golden light, the fields stretching out before them, quiet in the way only peace can be. No debts, no past heavy on their shoulders, just the sound of the wind moving through the grass and the soft clink of a teacup being set down. Sometimes he would glance at her, sometimes she would meet his eyes, and when she smiled, small, rare, but real, he would nod, like he understood something bigger than words could hold. Because in the end, it wasn't the gun that had saved him. It was her choice to stay, and that made all the difference.